No king rules forever, my son.
I see. Only darkness before me.
Without its master's command, the restless scourge will become an even greater threat to this world. Control must be maintained. There must always be
a meta card. Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos, and in today's video we're going to talk about the meta, the current meta, the past metas, and just general thoughts and takes that I've seen flying around and things that I've responded to in stream. And I kind of just want to get my thoughts out there on all things surrounding the Mythic Plus metagame mostly, although I do have some raid things to talk about as well in here. But as of right now, of course, everybody is talking about the big disruption to the meta that came with patch 10.1.5. And I want to preface this by saying this isn't going to be an augmentation evoker complaining. Ooh, what's happening here? Gone all green. Oh, maybe this is... Okay, it's the Citizens of Dalaran thing. Wow. I was just here for the intro. Anyways, I don't want to talk about augmentation evoker. I've got a video about that, but this recent meta that we've seen has been driven by much more than just augmentation evoker, although it does introduce a set of problems into this as well. And I guess the main thing I want to talk about is there's this kind of conversation I've been seeing happening on Reddit, on Twitter, in Twitch chats, where people have sort of been talking past each other and have been saying statements that are both true, but seem to contradict each other, or that they feel contradict each other, that don't actually contradict each other. So one side will be saying something like, this is the worst meta we've seen in ages. It's really rough out there to group. It's really rough out there to get title as something that's not one of the 5 specs in the current, Exodia comp. And then the other side of that's saying, shut up. You can play anything in time of 20. Stop complaining about this. There's always a meta. And aside from the shut up part, both sides, all the things that are said in here are true. But there are some important nuances here that matter a lot. So first of all, yes, you can basically always, in any season, time a 20 on basically any spec, on any spec in the game. In fact, this season, I'm pretty sure that every spec in the game is timed up north of 25s, although it's tough as well, because if you look at those, especially as you start getting higher, a lot of the ones that are timed are 1 off meta spec, and then 4 or 3 meta specs, so that ends up being a little bit of a distorting factor, and that's... if we ever do a video about this idea that people have of like, let's have a title for based on spec rather than based on score, alone. One problem with that would be that it would heavily incentivize that sort of gameplay. But the problem is that just because you can do anything in a plus 20 and make it work, it's not going to be the easiest way, and it's not necessarily going to be especially easy to get invited to groups on a lot of these specs. You can think of this sort of like, if somebody told you that you needed to go 10 miles in the next 2 hours, you could walk really fast and do that. You could run if you're a good runner, and you could do that. Or you could choose a car, and it would be quite easy to do. You could take a bus, you could take an Uber, right? And that's kind of the difference between choosing a meta spec or a non-meta spec in especially unbalanced seasons, especially as you start getting to the higher keys. As you're in lower and lower keys, it becomes more like walk 2 miles in 2 hours, which is still, much more effort than doing it in a car, but is very, very easy, right? In comparison to doing 10 miles, right? In 2 hours, something like that. So that's sort of the difference. But the thing that you can do anything in a plus 20 crowd are missing is that people are, the only thing they know about you when you sign up to a group is your spec, your eye level, your Raider IO score if they have the add-on. And so it's perfectly rational for those people to choose, if there's a spec that makes a key feel 1 or 2 key levels easier, which is a lot, or 3 or 4 key levels easier, which augmentation sort of does in a lot of cases, then it can be perfectly rational to select those people over the other people. And that's, that is not something that I think you can fix by yelling at content creators, first of all, and second of all, by yelling into the void at group makers in general. And I would argue that the content creator side of things is something, there's a lot of blame that gets thrown around here, and maybe I'm biased in this because I make a lot of videos and stuff talking about the meta, talking about what specs are good and why. But I will say that I've made those videos last season as well, and the group finder situation was a lot better than it is this season, or this patch. And I think that the variable that has changed hasn't been that content creators are talking about the metagame and talking about what specs are good and why. A lot of videos from last season talking about, I think they should nerf Prot Warrior a little bit. Oh, wow, Prot Paladin's getting some good buffs. This spec is going to be really good. All that stuff coming in. And it doesn't cause there to be a huge... Like, those videos being created doesn't cause, and, not just me, obviously, but a bunch of other content creators, that doesn't cause the huge change in the group finder. It is, in my opinion, the cause and effect you've got mixed up if you think that's what's causing it is posts or videos. The actual cause of both the videos getting made about augmentation and the group finder, plus 17 aug only groups existing is a very unbalanced game state. And that the solution to that lies with Blizzard for the most part. Obviously, all of us in our own groups can do what we can to try and, improve things. And if you look at a lot of the people that are putting out meta-based videos, if they're doing a weekly 17, they're inviting the first person who's signing up in a lot of cases and just going with whatever because they know they can do anything with the plus 20. They know that they're strong enough to carry the group in any case. But yeah, I think that one illustrative thing. So somebody sent me this on Discord, which there was a version of this that just had the Dragonflight seasons, and you could see how the specs got sort of represented in every week, and then you could see the incident here when augmentation came out. And I'll link this person. This person's working on a website, which I clicked on earlier, and it looks like it's up, or early versions of it's up. So I'll put that in the description below as well if you want to go see some more of their work. But this is a pretty cool way of showing how different seasons have happened in the past. And this, I think, does challenge the claim of it's always like this, which it's always true that there is a meta. It's often true that there is a clear best comp, especially when we look at something like TGP or MDI, right? Some very high level competition. And that isn't what people like me are complaining about. And people see this and they're like, oh, TGP always has, or MDI always has one comp that almost everybody plays. And that's often true. Obviously, we're always hoping, it's always great when top teams disagree about what the best stuff is, because that's just very interesting to watch. But it's very normal in an MMO like this for the top composition to be pretty clear, especially if there's something like MDI or TGP where there's multiple weeks. Very often, maybe the first week you'll see a little bit of divergence, and then the second week, every team will practice all the comps that did well, and they'll quickly converge and be like, yep, that one's a minute and a half faster. We're gonna go with that, right? That's something you see in many seasons. It's exceptionally good whenever Blizzard can create a metagame such that the very top teams are still disagreeing after being exposed to each other's strategies and comps, but that is not the bar that we're looking for here. Instead, the bar we're looking for here is we want this statement to be true for as many specs as possible. I am a blank main. I feel strong. I do not feel like I'm letting my team down by not re-rolling. I have cool and useful strengths in dungeons, and the weaknesses that I have relative to other specs, including meta specs, are things that I can mitigate it without it being clearly much worse than just playing those meta specs. And this season, that statement is basically not true for anything that's not one of these three specs. You can make an argument for an enhancement, and you can see enhancement's actually doing pretty well here. Boomkin even as well. There's some specs that are competing for that Fire Mage spot. You can see Fire Mage is definitely the lowest represented of these three DPS, but it is very difficult to make that argument for many specs, and there's a lot of bars here that you can see are just not existing at all. Now, people say, oh, it was just like this in Shadowlands Season 3 and 4, and helpfully, this chart actually does go back there, and we can see what those seasons looked like. So here's when Shadowlands Season 3 started, and you can see, yeah, there's some pretty big chunks here, but at its peak, Serve and Destro, I guess there's this week where we have 37, 36% for Destro, 26 and 30% for Serve, but there's no third spec that is taking up that much. There's several other good options. Fire, Outlaw, Windwalker, all above 5%. and a bunch of other little bars you can sort of see peeking in here. So even this season, which was touted and is often cited as like the, oh, balance is as bad as it is now. Like, no, it's not. This is worse. We can look at these graphs and we can see that this is in fact worse. And the other point is that it doesn't just mean that the lower level groups are looking at the top end meta and copying it and are too stupid to realize that it doesn't matter in their groups. Like, it does matter in their groups as well. It does matter if you go and do a weekly 20 and you have or don't have an augmentation evoker in your group, you can feel the difference. And obviously, sometimes you'll have a bad augmentation evoker, sometimes you'll have a great survival hunter, and the great survival hunter is better. But before you invite that person, you don't know whether the person is great or terrible. There's often a anecdote that I see in my chat that's basically like, oh, all these Fodom rerollers suck at their class, which I think is mostly... So again, I haven't pugged too much this season. I pug a lot at the start of seasons for gear, for raid, but one interesting thing about this season, and by the way, something that might be confounding part of the reason we might be seeing so many people having switched so quickly is that we aren't seeing very many people gearing up for raid in M+ right now. So it's possible that some of these earlier seasons, especially in the earlier weeks, look more diverse than they actually should have just from the M+ side of things, because people are gearing up in fairly high keys on their raiding mains. That is an important thing that might discredit my argument a little bit here, or that goes against my argument a little bit here. But anyways, the point is that the augmentation evoker does make it feel key levels easier, and I don't believe that there's a systematic... I don't believe that the average augmentation evoker in Group Finder is worse by any noticeable amount than the average off meta person that's in Group Finder. I think that they're about the same to some extent. There's the effect of maybe they've I mean, obviously any augmentation evoker can't have been an augmentation evoker main for long because that spec is new, but even Fire Mages or Shadow Priest, right? To some extent, maybe they just rerolled to it. But also, on the other hand, the kind of players that reroll pretty often to the best stuff, that's pretty heavily correlated with being a fairly committed, fairly engaged player that is also likely to be reasonably good at executing your rotation compared to other players. So I think those effects often end up roughly canceling out. But I've heard a lot of anecdotes on both sides, so I'm not especially confident in that either way. But yeah. Okay, one argument that does get made is that there are some specs that are really good in high keys and in TGP and stuff that aren't actually... It's not that it doesn't matter in lower keys, it's that different stuff is good in lower keys. And I think that is also generally wrong with a couple of exceptions. So augmentation, I think, is a good example of any key level you're doing, augmentation is going to feel pretty good. Obviously, it's at its best when it's playing with... the Fire Shadow augmentation combo is so strong because their cooldowns line up, and is very easy to coordinate as the augmentation evoker. And especially now, if you've played with a bunch of those groups, you've got a lot of experience knowing what they do and how to line up your CDs with theirs. So that is definitely something that can be relevant and important for this. But I think that there's often this argument, and it kind of falls flat, that some specs are expert level only specs. I think there's a little bit of that with Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest, Mass Dispel is a lot of the value they're bringing to higher keys. Shadow Priest in your weekly 20 might not be pressing that button. Power Infusion lining up with your other DPS, that's something you also might not be getting very much value out of in a weekly 20. Some Shadow Priests are, they're not even talenting twin priestesses or whatever, they're just PIing themselves, and you're going to see some crimes committed in Group Finder from time to time. And similarly, there are some specs that are dot based. Again, Shadow Priest sometimes, although not so much with their current damage profile. But Moonkin, that sometimes there's been specs, and sometimes there's been versions of these specs where they actually do work less well in lower keys because they require packs to live for a certain amount of time, or there are other sorts of characteristics like that to be able to thrive. So I think that is something that does happen sometimes, but usually, with those exceptions aside, it's generally true that the best spec for a plus 29 key is also the best spec for a plus 20 key, and is also often the best spec for a plus 10 key or a plus 5 key. And the same is also true in Raid, by the way, for the best specs in Race to World First guilds, often being the best specs for top 100, often being the best specs for top 1,000, often being the best specs even for heroic rating. Although, of course, as we get later into the season, the Warcraft logs top parses starts polluting everything, and you start just seeing the specs that get PI'd and, the unholy DKs or whatever that start looking really sick, even though the progression value is maybe less good. then those big damage charts will make you think. So that is one effect. One more caveat for Raid is priests. I think, again, there is something that maybe you can make an argument these are better in the high-end groups, especially Holy Priests. Holy Priests and Disc Priests, right? Disc Priests, it's like this sort of style of healing, and the way they work ends up working out better in the more coordinated, more prepared groups. And Holy Priests, the way that Symbol works and gives people their defensives back, that's also something that's worth more in groups where people are actually pressing their defensives and using them at coordinated times versus groups that aren't. So again, there are a couple of exceptions for this, but for the most part, the best stuff is the same in the high end and the low end groups. So basically, my thesis is, yes, there's always going to be a meta. Yes, there's often going to be agreement among the top teams about what the best comp's going to be, especially in MDI and TGP, but often in live key situations as well. Often in the highest live keys, you're going to start seeing some convergence. But even still, we hope to see a situation where it's like, oh, 60% of teams have landed on this, right? So we could look at like, actually, we could just look at, we could look at time run. So like right now, this is what the front page of Raider.io looks like, right? And this is especially bad from that perspective. And there are some seasons that look better than this, right? Like Dragonflight Season 1, again, you're seeing a lot of people landing on similar stuff, right? We're not seeing every tank on the front page. We're seeing a lot of Prot Paladin and only one Brave Prot Warrior. So there's, often a roll or two where things are looking like this. But there's also a lot of divergence, a lot of disagreement, a lot of people that, even if they know in theory there might be a comp that's better, and in MDI or TGP they would play that comp, but on live keys they know they can succeed with whatever they're doing, right? And they know they can play their main, and they know there's strengths to it, and they know there's reasons to make this comp, and that can be enough of a factor that means that even the best teams are playing that on live instead of just the most meta comp. Now, one confounding factor for this is ease of gearing up alts, and I've seen some tweets about this that say, well, if you make it so that anybody can gear up an alt in one day, which this season is much more true than previous seasons, you can do that, then you should expect that if the barrier to re-rolling is lower, then the metagame is going to look more like this, because more people will be like, oh yeah, I'll just re-roll because it's easy. And to some extent that's true, but I think that this season you would see people re-rolling to this, even if it was harder to re-roll. You'd maybe see one or two more teams where stubborn people were playing with their mains and didn't want to reroll, maybe. But I think you would still pretty quickly get these things geared up, even if it was previous systems gearing. Maybe you wouldn't have seen it take place over 1 week, the swap to this comp, really over like 36 hours like it did at the start of 10.1.5. But I think you would have still seen it very, very quickly among the top runs, and it would have just been more annoying to make that swap. So I think that the gearing up more quickly thing is not the right target to be mad at here. And if anything, it would suck more if there was a comp that was this good that was artificially being hidden, and it took like 3 months to swap a character and have a character be good enough to be worth playing or whatever, and you were just, if you weren't randomly playing or had been gearing because you gear 10 characters, a character that's in that comp, you were just out of luck. That would, I think, be much worse. So I do think that is an important difference. But yeah, aside from that, that's, I think the thing when we're looking at these comps and these groups here is that there's always going to be a meta, but it often doesn't look as rigid as it is right now. And it really matters how much better the best stuff is than the second best stuff. So when we're looking at like a prescriptive solution for what Blizzard should do right now, it's tough because they've nerfed all 5 of these specs now twice. So what should they do? Should they continue to nerf it? Then we run into this argument, and people are already making this argument of like, oh, this season is stupid. These plus 30 keys were so much easier, 2 weeks ago than they will be in 2 weeks, especially if these specs are nerfed twice in that time span, or 3 times in that time span. Are you going to be able to complete the same level of keys that you did before? I mean, maybe yes. Maybe if you practice and you get a lot better. But if you practice and get a lot better, shouldn't you be able to do higher keys than you did before? And I think that's a fair argument. And I think that Blizzard have to, in this sort of situation, they need to be willing to nerf the dungeons and make the dungeons easier by like a flat amount. And then also nerf the specs by enough to make it so that it's okay if these are the best specs, but they need to stop being the best specs by as much as they currently are. And it's tricky because this particular comp has a couple of other things going for it that add a lot of rigidity to it. First of all, because it's been the best comp and it's been the best comp by a lot, even if you imagine a world where this comp became equally good to Prot Warrior, Disc Priest, Sub-Rogue, Windwalker Enhancement, something like that, that would require a lot of people to change their characters, gear them up. Again, we talked about that being a low cost this season, but it's crucially not zero cost this season to do that. So that would, I think, mean that even if this comp was equally good as the next best thing, it would probably take a little while before we started to see recovery in the representation things. So that's an important thing to note, is that that you might not see that even if they actually succeeded at this goal. And the second thing is that this comp has so many other structural benefits, right? If you look at what you can replace in this comp, with the Augmentation Evoker, it's very hard to replace either DPS with a non-2-minute class. With the Shadow Priest, it's also very hard. If you take out the Shadow Priest, you're losing Fortitude, which makes the high-level dungeons a lot harder, but you're also losing Mass Dispel and Mind Soothe. And this season, Mass Dispel and Mind Soothe are both so good. And you've got to be careful, because often when there's a good spec, people fall into this trap of listing its utility as the reason why it's good. If you ask somebody back in Shadowlands Season 3, like, hey, why is Blood DK so good this season? They'd be like, oh, let me tell you. This is a spec that's got Death Grip. It's got, Mass Grip. It's just got so much mob control, and it can survive these bosses and just solo these bosses, and it doesn't require any healing. And it's got AMZ, and it can AMS these mechanics, and oh yeah, Blood DK is just so good. All of those characteristics of Blood DK are still true right now. Tyrannical Week is still great to be playing a Blood DK. You can still live basically every boss without needing any healer intervention. But what's changed between then and now is that Blood DK number has gone from Giga Broken. They've lost a Giga Broken tier set, right? So usually, when people start listing the utility of an existing best spec as the reason why it's a best spec, you got to look at that with a lot of suspicion, because that has happened in a lot of these seasons, right? If you ask, like, hey, why is Prot Warrior so good in Dragonflight Season 1? People will be like, oh man, look at all the stuff you can spell reflect. Not good offensive. You can reflect the second and fourth boss. And this season, you can reflect some stuff too. In fact, in Neltharian's Lair, you can reflect 3 of the 4 bosses. It's sick. But now if you ask people like, hey, why is Guardian good? A lot of them will start with stuff like, oh, Mark of the Wild. That's really strong. And the same with Shadow Priest, like Power Word Fortitude. And those are strong things, but a lot of it is also the number. However, with Shadow Priest, Mass Dispel kind of does rise especially, and Mind Soothe to a lesser extent, but Mass Dispel, in my opinion, does rise to a level of, if you're trying to do Halls of Infusion, and you're fighting those dragons, and a Deep Chill goes off, and you have or don't have a Mass Dispel, it's night and day difference in that situation. So if I was Blizzard, I would be looking to nerf most of these specs a little bit more. Probably not nerf Shadow directly, but I would nerf the dungeons by taking those effects like Deep Chill from the dragons and Halls of Infusion, or the 3 dots that go out on the last boss of Uldaman. And I would look at those effects and I'd be like, okay, well, this effect is very easy if we have a Mass Dispel, and very hard if you don't. Let's change that so that it is very easy if you have a Mass Dispel, and medium if you don't have it, right? Let's nerf the damage of these effects. Let's make it so that Mass Dispel is a nice thing where you're like, oh, cool, we have a priest for this, rather than, oh no, we don't have a priest. Okay, let's go to Underrot instead, right? Like that is the kind of experience that you have when you're looking at your keys that you really want to avoid. We've seen it in the past a little bit. If you look at BFA, a lot of these rogue seasons, it was sort of similar, where you'd be looking and you'd be like, okay, we're trying to do this dungeon without Shroud and stuff. Like, miss me with that, right? And we even saw in MDI and stuff in the later seasons that there were a lot of comps where they didn't use rogues, and then they'd get to a dungeon like Freehold, and it's just like, we just need this utility, or else we are in tremendous misery. So that is something to think about, I think, is nerf the dungeons, probably by a flat amount so that the best level of keys, and that helps the other comps as well, right? That helps the non-meta comps. You might be looking at that, be like, well, why does this comp deserve to effectively have an easier time? Well, this comp effectively got a way easier time when the patch came out, so it's only fair that it happens to the other comps as well, to the other specs in the game too. And then there's often this thing, whenever I say like, oh, they should probably nerf Guardian by a bit, people come out of the woodwork and they're like, don't. And in fact, I'm sure a lot of people have already hit send on this message in the comments. Don't nerf this comp. Buff all the other specs instead. Which, like, yeah, there's a lot of specs that could use a buff. They've been doing a good job, in fact. They buffed Unholy AoE this week. They buffed Rat AoE. They buffed Hunter like 2 of the past 4 weeks. They've buffed 4 total, or specs 4 total times now of Hunter in the past 4 weeks. They've been doing a good job of delivering some buffs. Obviously, there's more that can be done. You know, I think when you look at tank specs, especially seeing like, oh, Brewmaster got nerfed here this week was the week, and then we were like, okay, yeah, let's nerf. You see that little sliver there? Get him, right? Get Brewmaster. Get out of here. You can look at those things and you can be like, this is some suspicious balancing. There are some specs here that should get buffed. But realistically, when you play a Guardian Druid in a fortified high key and you can pull 30 mobs and not be in danger of dying and have your cooldowns run out and not have to kite and not be in danger of dying, like that, the tank is too good relative to the content. And in my opinion, the game is boring when a spec is that strong relative to the content. Holy Paladin, I'm a little bit less sure. I think the Holy Paladin, where they've got it right now, it could maybe use one more small nerf, but I think healers being about that strong in M+ is probably good, and the other specs mostly should be brought up to that level. I do think Guardian probably should be taken down another bit, and the other some of the other tank specs should be coming up as well, especially defensively. I think like the anti-fortified one-shot ability of specs like Blood DK, like Brewmaster, should be coming up a little bit in this patch. And then on the DPS side of things, augmentation is just a huge can of worms. I do think we either got to get it nerfed or we got to just accept that it's a locked-in group spot until they add more sport specs or change how augmentation functions at a core level. And I think it's probably best to just keep doing nerfs to it until it no longer feels awful to not be playing with one. But it's tough because I'm not sure you can do that without making it feel bad to be playing augmentation as well. So that one I'm not sure about what to do. Obviously, a lot of other specs in these little slivers here could potentially use some buffs too. And the shadow, like the synergy of the augmentation plus the shadow plus another 2-minute spec that carries those buffs well is a really hard thing to break apart as well. But you know, I think if you start delivering some more of these nerfs, and especially if you make the priest less mandatory with the master spell and stuff, you could start seeing wholly different comps where you just play 3 different specs entirely, right? Again, you see something like the Rogue Enhanced Warrior or something like that being something that could be played, the Rep Pally, right? There's a lot of stuff. You can look back at these bars here. There's a lot of specs that have good fundamentals that are just under the surface and just need the Exodia comp to be broken apart a little bit to start seeing play again. So that's my theory. That's what I think about the current balance, the current situation. It's a rough one. I think it's good that Blizzard are experimenting. I think mid-season's a good time to do stuff like introducing Augmentation Evoker. I do think we probably could have seen coming that Mage and Holy Paladin were going to be this OP after their reworks. Guardian even as well a little bit with how the talents were moved around. You know, that was effectively a pretty big buff to a spec that was already gaining metagame share even before that came out as well, you can see. Although you know, this kind of slow gain in metagame share I think is fine, because this is the sort of thing where it's like over the course of a season we're realizing something's good, but the other stuff you can still play, right? Like you can see it with Prot Warrior in Dragonflight Season 1. I got title this season playing Prot Warrior even as it was becoming dominated by Prot Paladin because it still felt fine to play. This season, if you're trying to do that on one of these other specs, it's a lot more difficult, although there are still some brave heroes out there. Of course, always doing it on stuff like Vengeance right now, which is good to see. Anyways, long video, kind of a disorganized thoughts vomit. I had a little notepad of things I was trying to get through, and I hope I was able to mention a lot of different things there. But those are mostly my take on the discourse surrounding the metagame. I hope that we can move to a better situation than this, not just for the high keys, but for the, you know, plus 17 augmentation only thing that you're seeing in Group Finder. And I like it when their metagame is interesting, when we can talk about different stuff that might be good, and when we can try cool things and have an idea for a spec that there might be a good reason to use it in some dungeon. But I also I like it when people can play their mains and can show this mastery that they've built up over the years on enhancement or elemental or whatever, or retribution, and really make that spec sing. And I think, you know, you can look at patch like 10.0.5, the Ret rework, as a huge triumph, for instance, of bringing Ret back into the mainstream, of like, hey, let's take the spec, let's rework it, let's give it some power, but let's not make it too OP, right? And they correctly delivered a bunch of nerfs to it from the early PTR version, and they forgot to do that with the Holy Paladin and the Fire Mage things, and that instead leads to a much less good state than, like, I think the Rep Pally thing was so healthy we were seeing in mid to late season 1 and early season 2 of Dragonflight, and I think that is the goal they should be going for with a lot of these specs. And it's not always going to be this good. A metagame that looks like this is a special treat. You don't always get this, but it also is not always this bad, and we can definitely hope for better and advocate for better until we get better on stuff like this. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.